The popular imagination, fed by a century of cinema and romantic fiction, demands that the samurai die in a storm of glory. We want the visual symmetry of the katana charging against the Gatling gun, the tragic collision of ancient honor and industrial callousness, creating a martyrdom that feels consistent with the warrior code. However, the historical reality of the samurai's extinction is far more unsettling because it was not a murder committed by foreign invaders, nor a slaughter by a rival clan, but a methodical suicide orchestrated by the samurai themselves. The destruction of Japan's warrior caste was a quiet, bureaucratic operation, a dismantling so precise and bloodless in its initial stages that the victims hardly realized their throats had been cut until they tried to speak. The architects of this destruction were not Western imperialists, but the very men of spirit from the Choshu and Satsuma domains who had overthrown the shogun to restore the emperor, only to realize that to save Japan, they had to destroy the class that built it. In the early 1870s, the collective psychological atmosphere of Japan was defined by a frantic, almost neurotic vertigo. The collective consciousness was gripped by Bunmei Kaika, civilization and enlightenment, a slogan that masked a profound national anxiety. Having witnessed the humiliation of China during the Opium Wars, the Japanese elite understood with terrifying clarity that the West was not just a military threat, but an existential one. To resist colonization, the nation had to modernize instantly, and modernization is intolerant of feudal inefficiency. Consequently, the new Meiji government looked at the samurai not as the soul of the nation, but as a crippling line item in the national budget. There were nearly 2 million samurai in Japan, and the hereditary stipends paid to them, essentially a salary for existing, consumed nearly half of the government's total tax revenue. No modern state could survive such a parasitic financial burden. Driven by this fiscal reality, the oligarchs, samurai themselves who had traded their armor for frock coats, began the cold work of legislative auto-cannibalism. The weapon that killed the samurai was not the howitzer, but the bond certificate. In a series of calculated administrative moves, the government first made the wearing of swords optional, stripping the act of its mandatory social dominance, and then moved to the financial jugular. They offered to convert the hereditary rice stipends into government bonds, a move that sounded equitable on paper but was devastating in practice. For the wealthy daimyo, this conversion provided the capital to invest in banks and industries, allowing them to transition seamlessly into the new aristocracy of capitalism. But for the vast majority of the warrior class, the conversion was a death sentence. Consider the plight of a low-ranking retainer in the reigns of 1876, a man whose family name might stretch back 3 centuries, but whose skills are limited to Confucian recitation and swordsmanship. He stands before a pawn shop in the newly gaslit Ginza district, clutching the shorter of his 2 blades, the wakizashi, wrapping it in cloth to hide the shame of the transaction. He is not fighting a glorious last stand. He is calculating the price of rice against the interest rate of a government bond that has already depreciated by half. This nameless figure, shivering in a cotton kimono that has seen too many winters, represents the true face of the samurai's end, not a warrior falling in battle, but a father realizing he has become obsolete. This dismantling was driven by a ruthless chain of causality. The government needed a conscript army to match the West. Consequently, the monopoly on violence held by the samurai had to be broken. Once the peasantry was armed, the samurai lost their military utility. Once they lost their military utility, their stipends became unjustifiable. Once the stipends were removed, their social status evaporated. It was a demolition conducted through the hereditary Edict of 1876, which finally banned the carrying of swords in public entirely. Police officers, often commoners or low-ranking samurai recruited into the new force, were empowered to confiscate the very soul of the warrior class. The psychological shock of this cannot be overstated. The sword was not merely a weapon, it was the physical manifestation of the samurai's right to execute justice, his history, and his soul. To walk the streets without it was to be castrated publicly. Yet when the edict came down, there was no nationwide uprising, no immediate civil war. There was only a stunned, sullen silence, the sound of 1,000,000 men realizing that the ink on a legislative document was heavier than steel. Had the Meiji oligarchs possessed even a fraction less resolute, the outcome might have been catastrophically different. One can imagine a counterfactual history where the government, fearful of their own kin, allowed the stipends to continue, bleeding the treasury dry within a decade. In this timeline, Japan defaults on its loans to British banks, the modernization stalls, and the islands are carved up by European powers just as China was. The fragility of Japan's independence in this era hung on the willingness of its leaders to commit this class-based fratricide. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, betting that the loyalty to the emperor would outweigh the survival instinct of the warrior caste. The tension in the government halls was palpable. Men like Okubo Toshimichi worked under the constant threat of assassination, knowing that every law they passed created 1,000 sworn enemies who were experts in killing. Inevitably, the pressure became too great, and the violence did finally erupt, most famously in the Satsuma Rebellion led by Saigo Takamori. But even this conflict serves to highlight the effectiveness of the bureaucratic strangulation that preceded it. By the time Saigo rose up in 1877, the samurai class was already a ghost. The rebellion was not a contest of equals. It was a desperate, chaotic spasm against a mechanized inevitability. The pacing of the conflict reveals the disparity. The slow, deliberate encirclement by the Imperial army, the logistical suffocation, the relentless barrage of artillery against men charging with cold steel. The iconic Battle of Shiroyama was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a forensic cleanup operation. The conscript army, peasant sons drafted and trained by the new state, mowed down the samurai with a dispassionate efficiency that proved the government's point. The age of the individual warrior was dead. The chaos of the battlefield, smoke, mud, the wet thud of flesh into blood, was merely the final punctuation mark on a sentence written years earlier in the Ministry of Finance. The legacy of this self-destruction is woven into the very DNA of modern Japan. The samurai did not vanish, they were sublimated. The ethos of the warrior, loyalty, endurance, the acceptance of death, was stripped of its feudal trappings and re-engineered into the ideology of the nation-state. The suicide of the sword was a necessary sacrifice, a burning of the bridge to the past so that there could be no retreat. Today, walking through the glass canyons of Tokyo's Marunouchi district, one can sense the lingering vibration of that decision. The ruthless pragmatism that allowed the samurai leaders to destroy their own class to save the nation is the same impulse that drove Japan's post-war economic miracle. The sword was melted down, but the steel remains, invisible now, supporting the skyscrapers and the corporate structures of a world that the samurai could never have imagined, but which they ultimately, through their own destruction, allowed to be born.
The silence that fell over the battlefield of Sekigahara in 1600 was not merely the end of a civil war, it was the beginning of a slow, suffocating atrophy for the class that had won it. For centuries, the samurai had defined themselves by proximity to death, their social standing inextricably linked to their utility in combat. However, when Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan and closed its borders, he inadvertently signed the death warrant for the warrior ethos. By enforcing a peace that would last over 200 years, the shogunate stripped the samurai of their primary function, leaving them stranded in a society that revered their history but had no use for their skills. Consequently, the masters of the sword were forced to become masters of the abacus, transitioning from battlefield commanders into salaried administrators within a vast, inefficient bureaucracy. This transformation was not a sudden abdication of duty, but a gradual erosion of purpose, driven by the rigid Confucian hierarchy that placed the warrior at the top of the social pyramid, while simultaneously denying them the economic means to sustain that position. The mechanism of this decline was built into the very foundation of the Tokugawa peace. To prevent insurrection, the shogunate mandated the system of sankin kotai, or alternate attendance, requiring feudal lords to maintain lavish residences in Edo and split their time between the capital and their domains. While this successfully drained the coffers of potential rivals, it inevitably trickled down to their retainers, who were forced to maintain the appearance of martial grandeur on fixed incomes. A samurai stipend was paid in koku, bales of rice, a currency that remained static in volume even as the complex commercial economy of the Edo period inflated around them. As the merchant class, theoretically the lowest rung of society, amassed fortunes through trade and usury, the samurai found themselves at the mercy of rice brokers who manipulated exchange rates. There is a specific cruelty in the ledger of a mid-ranking retainer from the 1830s, preserved in the archives of a regional clan, which details the sale of ancestral armor not to buy weapons, but to purchase charcoal and tea. The ink on the page is steady, betraying no emotion, yet the transaction marks the precise moment where heritage capitulated to hunger. This economic inversion created a peculiar psychological malaise that permeated the era. By the early 19th century, the samurai class was suffering from a collective cognitive dissonance, trapped between the myth of their own supremacy and the reality of their indebtedness. They walked the streets of Edo with two swords at their waist, symbols of the right to kill, yet they often owed their livelihood to the very shopkeepers they were legally entitled to cut down for disrespect. It was a zeitgeist defined by performative stoicism, masking deep existential anxiety. The tea ceremonies, the poetry competitions, and the rigid adherence to etiquette were not merely cultural refinements, they were desperate attempts to maintain distinctiveness in a world where economic power had decisively shifted to the commoner. Had the shogunate allowed the samurai to engage in commerce, to dirty their hands with silver rather than ink, the class might have evolved organically. Instead, the regime doubled down on moral prohibitions against profit, locking the warrior class into a trajectory of genteel poverty. The fragility of this arrangement was absolute, yet it remained invisible to those within the system who mistook stasis for stability. The peace had lasted so long that it felt immutable, a permanent condition of the Japanese archipelago. This illusion of permanence fostered a dangerous complacency in the military readiness of the nation. Armor sat in storehouses, lacquered boxes fusing shut with humidity and age, while coastal defenses were manned by skeleton crews who had never fired a cannon in anger. In the coastal town of Uraga, a young guard noted in his diary that the gunpowder reserves had turned into a paste due to neglect, a forensic detail that illustrates just how hollow the shogunate's shell had become. The state was a facade, formidable in appearance, ornate in ritual, but structurally rotted by 2 centuries of peace that it could no longer afford. Then came the smoke. On July 8, 1853, the arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet in Edo Bay didn't just break the isolation, it shattered the temporal suspension in which Japan had existed. The panic that ensued was not merely a fear of invasion, but a terrifying realization of obsolescence. The 4 black ships, belching dark smoke against the summer sky, moved against the wind, powered by a technology that defied the natural order understood by the samurai. Cinematic pacing dictates that we view this moment as a clash of civilizations, but the reality was far more chaotic and pathetic. The shogunate's response was paralyzed by bureaucratic infighting. Messengers scrambled between Edo Castle and the coastal batteries, carrying orders that were obsolete before they were delivered. The pacing of history shifted instantly from the slow, deliberate rhythm of the tea ceremony to the frantic, staccato beat of an industrial crisis. Consider the perspective of a single, unnamed, low-ranking samurai standing on the shore of Kanagawa that morning. He is 40 years old, a man whose hands are stained with ink rather than blood, wearing a family crest that commands respect he cannot pay for. He grips the hilt of a sword forged 300 years ago, a blade that is a masterpiece of metallurgy, but utterly useless against the Paixhan guns mounting the decks of the Susquehanna. In his eyes, we do not see the resolve of a warrior, but the bewilderment of a man watching his entire world view evaporate in the heat haze of the steam engines. He is the personification of the shogunate's failure, a symbol without substance, a guardian who cannot guard. The arrival of the West exposed the economic lie at the heart of the samurai existence. To modernize, to build the ships and cast the cannons necessary to repel the barbarians, the state required massive capital. Yet the nation's wealth was locked in the hands of merchants who had no political power, while the state's revenue was consumed by the stipends of a warrior class that provided no military value. It was an impossible equation. The shogunate couldn't tax the merchants enough to fund a modern military without overturning the social order, nor could it abolish the samurai stipends without inciting a revolution. Driven by this fiscal paralysis, the regime began to splinter. Had Perry arrived 10 years later, or had the Russians arrived 10 years earlier, the specific fracture lines might have differed, but the collapse was inevitable. The burden of peace had become heavier than the cost of war. Ultimately, the fall of the Tokugawa was not a conquest by foreign powers, but an internal implosion triggered by the realization that the samurai were a luxury the nation could no longer sustain. The systemic rot, hidden by the rituals of the Edo period, was laid bare by the mere presence of the steam engine. This transition left a profound scar on the national consciousness, a legacy that survives in the corporate boardrooms of modern Tokyo. The samurai did not disappear, they were metabolized into the new state. The fierce loyalty to the feudal lord was transferred to the corporation and the nation-state, the sword replaced by the business card, and the stipend by the salary. The intense pressure of the modern Japanese salaryman, the rigid hierarchy, and the deep sense of duty to the organization are the spectral remnants of that Edo period bureaucracy, a ghostly echo of a warrior class that learned painfully that survival required more than just a sharp blade.
The silence that fell over Edo in 1868, soon to be rechristened Tokyo, was not the peace of resolution, but the heavy, humid stillness of a holding breath. The shogun was gone, resigned to a quiet retirement in Shizuoka, and the Emperor Meiji, a 16-year-old boy with teeth blackened in the archaic court style, now sat at the apex of the Japanese state. To the casual observer, or a foreign merchant peering through a telescope in Yokohama, it appeared that the natural order had simply restored itself. The ancient monarchy had reclaimed its rightful throne from the military usurpers. However, the reality on the ground was far more cynical and far more precarious. The restoration was not a return to the past, but a desperate, terrified lunge toward the future, driven by a specific, suffocating anxiety that gripped the nation's new architects.
This was the collective psychosis of the era, a paralyzing fear that without rapid industrialization, Japan would be carved up like a melon, just as China had been by the British opium traders. Consequently, the low-ranking samurai from Satsuma and Choshu who had engineered this coup found themselves in a paradox. They had utilized the rhetoric of tradition to seize power, yet to secure that power, they would be forced to dismantle the very traditions that gave their lives meaning. The first obstacle to this survival was the map of Japan itself. The country was not a unified nation, but a patchwork quilt of over 260 feudal domains, or han, each ruled by a hereditary daimyo with his own laws, his own taxes, and his own private army. In the eyes of the new oligarchs, men like Okubo Toshimichi and Kido Takayoshi, this fragmentation was a fatal inefficiency. A modern state required a centralized treasury to buy battleships and build railways, but the tax revenue was trapped in the hands of regional lords. Driven by this cold arithmetic, the government executed a maneuver of breathtaking audacity in 1871. In a series of tense, rain-slicked meetings, they summoned the daimyo to the palace and ordered them to return their registers of land and population to the emperor. It was a revolution by decree, a paper coup that stripped the feudal lords of power held for centuries. Had the daimyo coordinated their resistance, had a single charismatic lord drawn his sword in that moment and declared the order void, the fragile imperial government would likely have collapsed into a bloody civil war that would have left the door wide open for French or British intervention. Instead, stunned by the speed of the decree and placated by the promise of generous government bonds, the lords acquiesced. The domains were abolished, replaced by prefectures run by Tokyo-appointed governors. The feudal map was erased, not by fire, but by bureaucratic fiat. Yet the abolition of the domains exposed a deeper, more dangerous problem: the samurai themselves. For centuries, the warrior class had enjoyed a hereditary stipend, a salary paid in rice, regardless of whether they worked or fought. With the domains gone, the central government assumed this financial burden, and the cost was catastrophic. By 1872, stipends for the samurai were consuming nearly half of the entire state budget. The new government was effectively bankrupting itself to pay a standing army of idle swordsmen who were increasingly hostile to the modernization efforts. Inevitably, the logic of the spreadsheet clashed with the logic of the sword. The oligarchs realized that they could not afford to maintain a privileged caste of warriors who contributed nothing to the gross domestic product. To build a nation capable of resisting Western imperialism, they had to fire their own class. They had to democratize violence. The instrument of this betrayal was the Conscription Act of 1873, crafted by Yamagata Arimoto, a man who viewed the romanticism of the samurai with the unsentimental eye of a logistics officer. The act declared that all males turned 20 must serve 3 years in the active military, regardless of social origin. It was a profound shock to the national psyche. For 1,000 years, the right to bear arms and kill for the state had been the exclusive moral monopoly of the samurai. It was their soul, their identity, and their justification for existence. Now the government was handing rifles to farmers. There's a specific tactile gravity to this shift that can be found in the diaries of the early conscripts, men who had spent their lives bowing in the mud as samurai passed, now finding themselves strapped into uncomfortable leather boots, their calloused hands fumbling not with a hoe, but with the cold, machined brass of a Snyder Enfield. Consider a 19-year-old conscript from a rice village in Tohoku, standing in a gravel courtyard, shivering in a wool uniform that smelled of foreign chemicals. He didn't know the code of Bushido. He knew the harvest cycle. Yet placed in a line with 100 others, taught to load, aim, and fire on command, he became a unit of destruction far more efficient than the individual swordsman. This shift terrified the samurai class, not merely because it threatened their income, but because it shattered the myth of their indispensability. If a peasant with 6 weeks of drilling could kill a master swordsman with a lifetime of training, then the samurai was not a superior being. He was merely an expensive relic. The psychological humiliation was compounded by the Hereditary Edict of 1876, which banned the wearing of swords in public. The 2 swords at the hip were the physical manifestation of the samurai's soul, the visible proof of his right to cut down commoners for disrespect. Stripping them away reduced the warrior to a civilian. The atmosphere in the dojos and tea houses of the former castle towns turned poisonous. Whispers of treason circulated against the traitors in Tokyo who wore Western suits and drank red wine while the soul of Japan was sold for scrap metal. The tension broke, as it had to, in violence. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 was the dying gasp of the old order, led by Saigo Takamori, a man who had helped build the Meiji state, only to recoil in horror at what it had become. But when the samurai charged the imperial lines, screaming their ancestral war cries, they did not meet terrified peasants who broke and ran. They met a wall of disciplined fire. The conscript army, fed by supply lines and commanded by telegraph, stood its ground. The battles were not duels of honor, they were industrial slaughters, where volume of fire dictated the victor. In the mud of Tabarusaka, the rain mixed with the blood of men who had believed their spirit could overcome ballistics. It was a brutal, forensic proof of the new reality. The conscript army fired 320,000 rounds of ammunition a day during the height of the conflict. Against this curtain of lead, the sword was useless. The defeat of the samurai was total. The class that had ruled Japan for 7 centuries was extinguished not by a foreign invader, but by the very modernization they had initiated. The oligarchs had centralized power, securing the tax base and the military monopoly necessary to build a modern nation-state. They had betrayed their past to secure their future. Yet the legacy of this transformation remains etched into the bedrock of modern Japan. The samurai were abolished as a class, but their ethos was not destroyed, it was nationalized. The Conscription Act took the loyalty once owed to a feudal lord and redirected it toward the abstract concept of the emperor and the nation. Every male citizen became a warrior, and the indoctrination of the barracks replaced the code of the clan. The fierce, suicidal dedication that had once belonged to a privileged few was mass-produced and injected into the bloodstream of the entire population, creating the spiritual engine that would drive the Japanese Imperial Army across Asia in the decades to come. The peasant with the rifle had not just replaced the samurai, he had absorbed him. By 1876, the euphoria of the Meiji Restoration had dissolved into the cold gray light of fiscal reality. The new imperial government, intent on forging a modern nation-state capable of standing shoulder to shoulder with the Western powers, found itself shackled to the corpse and the feudal past. The samurai class, numbering nearly 2 million, absorbed a staggering 30% of the national budget in the form of hereditary stipends, a financial hemorrhage that rendered industrialization impossible. Driven by this mathematical impossibility, the oligarchs in Tokyo realized that to build the future, they had to starve the past. Consequently, the dismantle of the warrior caste began, not on a battlefield, but in a bureaucratic office, with the stroke of a pen that converted their guaranteed rice incomes into government bonds. It was a masterstroke of economic violence. The bonds were issued at values far below the market rate of the stipends, and in an economy rapidly inflating due to modernization efforts, their real value evaporated within months. A collective vertigo seized the samurai caste, a psychological state of disorientation where men who had been raised to believe they were the moral and martial spine of the nation suddenly found themselves designated as obsolete parasites. The zeitgeist of the late 1970s was thick with a specific, suffocating dread. It was the realization that the world had not just changed, but had inverted its own logic. To be a samurai was no longer a badge of honor, but a sentence of poverty. Evidence of this destitution can still be found in the dusty ledgers of Tokyo pawnbrokers from that year, where entries list centuries-old heirlooms, lacquered armor, ceremonial tea sets, and silk kimonos exchanged for pittance sums to buy charcoal or rice. Consider the plight of a nameless, low-ranking retainer in a rural prefecture, a man whose family had served a lord for 6 generations, now standing in a muddy market square, attempting to sell the very armor his grandfather wore, only to be told by a merchant that the silk lacing was rotting and the iron worth less than scrap. This was the human face of the decree, a slow, humiliating erasure of identity, executed through the mechanism of insolvency. The government, however, was not content with merely bankrupting the samurai. They sought to break their spirit entirely. The Haitore Edict of 1876, banning the wearing of swords in public, was the final psychological severance. The katana was not merely a weapon, it was the physical manifestation of the samurai's soul and his social standing. Stripping it away was a form of spiritual castration, a signal that the monopoly on violence had shifted permanently from the individual warrior to the state. Inevitably, this accumulation of economic strangulation and cultural erasure coalesced into rage. It centered on Saigo Takamori, the tragic icon of the era, who retreated to Kagoshima to establish a private academy that was, in truth, a breeding ground for insurrection. The Satsuma rebellion that followed was fueled not by a hope of victory, but by the nihilistic desire for a death that still held meaning. When the rebellion finally erupted in 1877, it moved with the desperate, frantic energy of men who knew they were already ghosts. The Satsuma forces, numbering nearly 30,000, marched north to lay siege to Kumamoto Castle. Here, the narrative friction between the old world and the new became physical. Inside the castle were peasant conscripts, armed with Enfield rifles and trained in Western drill. Outside were the samurai, relying on spirit, swords, and outdated tactics. Had the garrison at Kumamoto panicked in those first critical days, had the peasant conscripts broken rank at the sight of the screaming samurai charging through the smoke, the rebellion might have gained enough momentum to fracture the fragile national unity. But the conscripts held. They fired in volleys, mechanically, efficiently, proving that 3 months of drill could negate a lifetime of martial cultivation. The siege dragged on for weeks, turning into a muddy, freezing attrition that favored the side with the telegraph lines and the supply depots. The pacing of the war shifted abruptly as the Imperial Relief Army arrived. The conflict devolved into a series of brutal, rhythmic engagements where the outcome was dictated by logistics rather than valor. Rain fell incessantly. Mud clogged the breech loaders. Men fought hand to hand in ravines choked with bamboo. Yet the Imperial forces possessed a relentless industrial advantage, ammunition reserves that did not run dry, and fresh troops arriving by steamship. The samurai were fighting a war of moments. The Imperial government was fighting a war of tonnage. Consequently, the retreat of the Satsuma forces back to Kagoshima was a slow bleed, a chaotic unraveling of the rebel army as they were pushed relentlessly southward. The romantic image of the samurai charge was shredded by the mechanistic reality of the Gatling gun and the Armstrong cannon. The end came at Shiroyama, a hill overlooking Kagishima, where Saigo and his final few hundred followers dug in for the last stand. It was a grim finality. The Imperial army, numbering 30,000, surrounded the hill, constructing a ring of earthworks and artillery placements that tightened like a noose. The bombardment began at 4 a.m. Shells tore through the trees, rock shattered, flesh unmade. The sheer volume of fire was so intense that trees on the hillside were later found packed with lead, stripped of branch and bark by the hail of bullets. Saigo, wounded in the hip, engaged in the final ritual of seppuku, assisted by a loyal retainer, ending his life before capture could disgrace him. The remaining samurai charged into the guns, not to win, but to die on their own terms. It was over at breakfast. The silence that fell over Shiroyama was absolute, broken only by the cawing of crows and the tramp of boots as conscripts moved among the bodies of the legendary warriors they had just annihilated. The defeat of the Satsuma Rebellion was the final proof that the era of the sword was dead, killed not by a superior philosophy, but by the crushing weight of modernity and the centralized state. The samurai were legislated out of existence, but the state they left behind carries its ghost in its machinery, a legacy of steel hidden beneath the suits of a modern industrial superpower.
The air in Tokyo in the late 1870s did not smell of cherry blossoms. It smelled of coal smoke and wet wool, the olfactory signature of a nation hurriedly shedding its skin. The physical dismantling of the samurai class was not a gradual fading, but a sharp, bureaucratic amputation, finalized by the Haitore Edict of March 1876. In a single stroke of legislation, the wearing of swords, the defining soul mark of the warrior caste for a millennium, was outlawed. Police officers, many of them former low-ranking samurai themselves, roamed the muddy streets of the capital, confiscating family heirlooms from men who suddenly looked naked without the steel at their hips. Driven by the desperate necessity to modernize, the Meiji oligarchs understood that a centralized state could not exist while a privileged class held the monopoly on violence. Consequently, the feudal lords were bought off with government bonds, and the warriors were cast adrift into a market economy for which they were woefully unprepared. Yet, a nation cannot simply delete its history without risking a psychological collapse. The abolition created a dangerous vacuum in the Japanese collective consciousness. For centuries, the social order had been held together by the vertical loyalty of vassal to lord. Without it, the new government risked ruling over a population of aimless individuals rather than a cohesive citizenry. It was here, in the quiet chambers of the Ministry of Education and the barracks of the new Imperial Army, that a masterstroke of cultural alchemy was performed. The government realized that while the samurai as a class were an obstacle, the samurai ethos was a fuel source of limitless potential. They set out to democratize the code of the warrior, stripping it of its feudal allegiance to local daimyo and re-engineering it into a nationalistic religion directed solely at the emperor. This was not the preservation of tradition, it was the invention of it. The architect of this psychological reconstruction was often less a general than a scholar. Men like Nitobe Inazo, writing in the polished English of the West, codified Bushido not merely as a set of battlefield tactics, but as the soul of Japan. This new state-sanctioned Bushido was injected directly into the veins of the populace through the school system. The Imperial Rescript on Education, issued in 1890, was treated not merely as a curriculum guideline, but as a holy text. In rural schoolhouses across the archipelago, portraits of the emperor were stored in fireproof safes, guarded with more reverence than the treasury. A 6-year-old son of a rice farmer, whose grandfather would have been executed for daring to look a samurai in the eye, was now taught that he possessed the same spirit, the same duty, and the same honor as the legendary warriors of old.
He was told that his life was lighter than a feather when weighed against his duty to the throne. The fragility of this experiment cannot be overstated. Had the peasant conscripts of the new Imperial army broken rank and fled during the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, when they faced the terrifying sword-wielding charge of the last true samurai, the myth of the citizen warrior would have shattered before it could set. The government's narrative hung by a thread. A single rout could have proven that the samurai spirit was genetic, not cultural. But the conscripts held. They fired their imported rifles with disciplined volleys, mowing down the romantic icons of the past. In that mud-streaked victory, the government proved that the spirit of the samurai could be detached from the samurai class and transplanted into the son of a fisherman. The monopoly on honor was broken, and the state had seized the copyright. This nationalized Bushido reached its terrifying maturity on the battlefields of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. The world watched in stunned silence as Japanese soldiers, fueled by this synthesized ethos, threw themselves against the machine guns of a European power with a ferocity that defied Western logic. Zoom in on a single figure amidst the carnage of Hill 203. A 19-year-old conscript from a remote village in Tohoku, shivering not from cold, but from adrenaline, gripping a rifle that cost more than his father's lifetime earnings. He does not fight for a local lord, nor for pay, nor even for territory. He fights because he believes, with the certainty of gravity, that his death will contribute to the eternal corpus of the divine state. He is no longer a peasant. The state has convinced him he is a samurai, and in believing it, he makes it true. Inevitably, this spirit bled beyond the barracks and into the factories and boardrooms that were rapidly transforming the Japanese skyline. The discipline required to charge a Russian trench was repurposed for the assembly line. The zaibatsu, massive industrial conglomerates like Mitsubishi and Mitsui, adopted familial structures that mirrored the old feudal clans. The company president became the daimyo, the worker became the retainer. A ledger from a textile mill in Osaka, dated 1910, records shifts of 14 hours, maintained not just through coercion, but through a propagated sense of service to the nation's industrial rise. The steam whistle replaced the conch shell, but the underlying demand for total abnegation of the self remained absolute. The rapid industrialization of Japan, often cited as an economic miracle, was powered by a workforce that viewed production as a form of combat. The legacy of this cultural engineering remains etched in the glass and steel of modern Tokyo. The samurai did not vanish. They dissolved into the bloodstream of the corporate organism. Today, the salaried worker who remains at his desk until the last train departs, driven by an unspoken code of loyalty to the company and a fear of the shame of leaving early, is the direct spiritual descendant of the Edo period retainer. The suits have replaced the kamishimo, and the exchange of business cards has replaced the formal introduction of lineage, but the structural DNA is identical. The Meiji government's great trick was not destroying the past, but expanding it until it encompassed the entire future, ensuring that long after the last sword was rusted and forgotten, the spirit of the blade would continue to govern the rhythm of the state.